All right, thank you, Mike. A congresswoman running for governor in Tennessee is causing some controversy with her recent comments about school shootings. Representative Diane Black says pornography, as well as violent movies and the deterioration of the family, is the root cause of our gun violence epidemic. Now, is she scapegoating or is she making a fair point? Joining us now to discuss this is Dr. Nancy Zarse. She's a forensic psychologist with the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Good morning, as always. Thank you so much for coming in. Good morning. A lot to get to. Let's get right to Anita's first question with regard to Diane Black. Is this scapegoating? Does she make any sort of valid point here?
There's no research that links pornography to violence of any kind. It's not a risk factor for violence, nor, quite frankly, is her comments about the family related. Is there any research to support that as a risk factor for violence? Well, you know, in addition to what she's saying, there are others who believe that playing these violent games, and there was recently a video game that was pulled. They were going to release a video game. I don't know exactly who was going to release it, but I believe it was going to be released on Steam, which is a location where you can get these video games. But it showed an active shooter from the viewpoint going into the classroom, very violent. But you know, that game didn't make it out, or they're not going to. But there are other games that are out there that some lawmakers say it's the video games that's causing these children to be violent. Do you buy that? So let's separate out issues. Is there a connection between violent video games and violence? Yes. The research is actually quite clear that violent video games increase the risk of aggression thought, and aggressive feelings. Okay, does that mean it's causal, and is that the only factor? No. So there's a correlation. But you can also put it in the context of violent popular culture. We want to parse out violent video games and ignore violent movies, violent TV, and violent music. Right. All of that increases risk of aggression.
Yeah, to your point, when we look at some of the stats, they are really startling. About 90% of kids play video games every day. The number of school shootings statistically is infinitesimal when compared to the number of kids that are playing video games. But I think you're talking more about how we behave, how our children are behaving at school. They might be rough with someone else, right?
Correct.
Physically rough, or maybe berate them because a video game has led them to that aggressive behavior.
Correct. So think of it as almost a continuum. And we've got lower level aggression, aggressive statements, aggressive behavior before we get to outright violence. And one of the things that happens is that the children who are playing, and young adults who are playing these games, are learning aggression and physical activity as a response to problems. So it's influencing their problem-solving strategies and their coping mechanisms. But Doctor, you know, there are kids who play these games and they don't do some of these things. The vast majority do not. So what's the difference? Do they have a different support group that, you know, maybe the gunmen in these cases don't have? Do they have parents intervening, therapists? I mean, what do you think? Well, you have to look at, there's a multitude of risk factors for violence. And this is the problem in our society. We want to parse out one and say, this is the problem. There's a multitude. Think of a pot simmering on the stove. Violent popular culture is in there. So is alcohol and drugs. So is anger. So is easy access to weapons. All of that is percolating. And then if you have somebody who accumulates grievances and injustices and has a pro-violence stance, they might be the ones that would be inclined to act on violence.
Parkland, Florida shooter seemed to be, by all accounts, have a lot of difficulty growing up, lost his parents. Yes. We look at the Santa Fe shooter, ostensibly seemed to be a pretty normal kid. How challenging is this to identify these would-be shooters?
It's very challenging. There's no profile. We want to look at risk factors, we want to look at warning signs, and then we want to evaluate behaviors. Now, with the first one, loss, recent failures, humiliations, those are all risk factors. Those are what we call triggers. So maybe I've got these other risk factors, again, percolating, and then this trigger becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back. So the loss, the recent failures, humiliations, financial problems. Well, what would you say to school officials? Because a lot of times it is maybe not caught at home, but you may have a teacher, you may have a counselor, somebody. I mean, what should they be looking for? And can you just call anybody in that you're a little concerned about? And should they? No. And so what we want is we want to provide training to schools, to teachers, to parents, even to students, to the community on violence risk assessment. Let's educate people as to the warning signs, the risk factors. What are the behaviors we want you to report, and then how do we assess them, and where do we go with that?
Mm-hmm. We're out of time, but real quick, the kids at Santa Fe are back to school today. A couple of words on how critical it is that they get counseled.
Absolutely critical. We need debriefing, we need therapy, we need support. Absolutely. For students and teachers and parents.
That's a very good point. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you.
Always love your perspective.
Thanks so much.
841.